Hi, welcome everybody to the latest CTO Craft Bytes. Today we are joined by Michael Stahnke, VP of Engineering at Flox Dev. If this is your first time at CTO Craft Bytes, let me tell you a bit more about this group. CTO Craft is a mentoring and learning community for technology leaders around the world, focusing on supporting our members in their leadership growth. The community has tens of thousands of members, and CTO Craft provides them with coaching, mentoring circles, a curated Slack community, international conferences, and events like this one. If you're not a member of the CTO Craft community and are interested in becoming one, or you'd like to get updates on these events via email, I'll post some links in the chat to help you do that. Huge thanks to CTO Craft sponsors for making these Bytes events possible, partners like Google Cloud, Vention, Albany Partners, amongst others. And thank you to UpLevel in particular for partnering with us for this event. CTO Craft membership gives you full access to some unique benefits from some of these partners, so please do click in the links in the chat to find out more. I'm Megan, and I'm the community manager at CTO Craft, and joining me today is Michael, and I will now pass the reins on to him.
All right. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm Michael Stahnke. I'm the VP of Engineering at Flox Dev, and you can find me all over the internet, usually with Stahnke as the handle, if you care to do that. So I'm going to talk today about engineering metrics. It's something that I've been working on for many years, and we'll dig into that, and then I'll tell you kind of my journey with that, and hopefully you can learn a few things. And if you have some questions, please place them in the chat. I'll answer them at the end. I can't see the chat live while I'm presenting, so I will handle them at the end just due to logistics. So a bit about me. I've spent time in big enterprise. I've spent time in startups. I've been in the dev tooling space for the last 12, 13 years. But started at Caterpillar doing infrastructure architecture and system administration work and kind of CSE things, and then moved into Puppet. So I went from a company of 100,000 down to a company of 35. And then from Puppet we grew that to about 525, 530 when I was there. And then Circle CI came in there at around 200 people. That got up to about 600 people. And now I'm at Flox, which is a small company. We're about 17 people, and we're working to change the way software development happens, kind of working with more reproducible builds and things like that. So it's a lot of release engineering and stuff like that, and it uses Nix under the hood. It's really cool. But there's just a lot of stuff going on from a metrics perspective at all these places that I'll kind of draw experience from and share with you today. So when I was at Puppet was when I really started to think about metrics and what makes teams work. And this started out with a simple question from, does DevOps actually make business better? That was really the question we set out to solve when we started doing these State of DevOps reports. And if you recall, I think the first one was in 2013. I started getting very involved in these in about 2016, 2017, where I was a reviewer for a little while. And then later I was a primary author on these reports from, I think it was 2018 until 2022. And so I spent a lot of time doing research, doing surveys, kind of survey crafting, figuring out the answers to these and what hypotheses we wanted to measure and test. So I've spent a lot of time kind of figuring out what are these metrics and how do we measure them, and has a lot of the early conversations. DORA started at Puppet, things like that. So there was a lot of this stuff is all joined and has a common genesis point. From there, I went to Circle CI, where I was very excited to get a data set instead of a survey set to do a lot of the slicing and dicing. And so I authored the first one of these state of software delivery reports that was more based on the data versus survey responses, and then that continued, and it still continues today from Circle CI. I do want to thank UpLevel. That's where I got connected with UpLevel because of my work on engineering metrics. I do some advisory work for them, and I like their product and things like that. So I'm not going to pitch it to you at all, but I just want to say, hey, I am involved there. I don't want to hide that or anything like that. I do advisory work for UpLevel. So let's start out with just kind of the basics of these metrics that we've all come to know and love. A lot of people call them the DORA metrics. Sometimes they're called accelerate metrics. I usually just call them the DevOps metrics because the genesis of them actually was kind of a little bit before DORA, but that's not really that important. Anyway, the point is we ask a lot of questions, and then we have a lot of this response that comes in through surveys. Typically on these surveys, we've had between 1,500 and 5,000 respondents, depending on the year. And so you have a pretty significant sample size, different firm sizes, things like that to kind of draw from. And so this is the leading body of work as to how metrics work in the space, for engineering and technology delivery. So why doesn't this make me feel great about everything? I've been very involved in this. Well, let's look at this. Okay, so this was a few years ago, but 2018, 2019, 21. So we have these tiers of low, medium, high, and elite. And when I was working, particularly at Circle CI is where I'll draw a lot of this experience from, because this is when I was kind of able to take learning in academics and apply it in a very wide swath. we were in this elite tier. And so when we were here, we were in this elite tier. We were like, everything that we had was either elite or right on the borderline, like of high and elite. So right, touching where those circles touch. And so we were in pretty good company, we thought. And, we kind of looked around, and I was talking with my boss, the CTO at the time. And it was just, well, are you satisfied with this if you're in this elite tier? And I kind of thought about it. And I was like, well, no, not really. Do I really believe that I'm elite? I can measure myself against these things, and I can measure myself against these peer groups, and it kind of shows me all this in the survey, but I don't feel like we're like the best at the world at delivering technology or at shipping new content out to customers or whatever it was that we were measuring. I thought we were pretty good at it, like darn good at it, but not like great, not like world class, not like I want to write a paper about it and share it with the world and everybody should listen to me. And so I started to think about it. Well, why don't I feel this way? And so I went back and I started to think about, well, what's the variance that we have here? And one of the things is the way that they measure this elite tier starts out with a question that's worded for the primary application or service you work on. Well, if I ask 3 people on the same team, what is the primary application or service you work on? I might get 3 different answers. In fact, for many teams, at least at Circle CI, I would get 3 different answers. And so that you already have a variance on. Surveys are also kind of notorious for, well, selection bias of who decides to fill out the survey, but then also, are you having a good day that day? Are you having a bad day that day? Do you think about things in best case scenario? Do you always think about things in worst case scenario? So when you fill out this survey data, it's usually consistent across the one person that fills it out. But if you actually put 5 of them next to each other, you don't know how consistent they are across each other. Like, were they all looking at best case scenario the entire time? Were they all working at worst case scenario the entire time? Basically, there's a lot of variance with humans is part of the issue here. And so the primary application or service you work on, are you good at this, blah, 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 is kind of a question that I think doesn't lend toward a great answer. I'm not saying there's a better way to do this. These surveys have moved the entire industry forward in a very nice way. But it just means there's some variance here. And once you're in that elite tier, that's the variance that starts to matter. So where did I find my orgs historically? I found them usually in the elite tier. It was things that we had worked really hard on, we were delivering, we were shipping often, we didn't have an extremely large lead time, our recovery times were pretty good. All of those metrics were well within the error bars, or at least most of the time within the error bars. But I just didn't feel elite. And so, well, what does that really mean? Well, how else can I dig into this? Why don't I feel elite? Why don't I feel like we're darn good at this? And then, like, what does real elite look like? In my mind, elite was, well, do I look like Google? And then I think about it, I'm like, well, I don't have Google scale. I don't have Google problems. I don't have, I'm not sitting there dissecting protocols, trying to reinvent them to shave 5% faster performance and things like that. So maybe that's not even the thing I want to compare myself with. Well, what else is elite? And I just started thinking about it. And I really spent a lot of time kind of just solving this and like processing it in the background and thinking about it. Like, what does elite really mean in this space? And I came back with, I want to be able to move fast with confidence. And moving fast, pretty easy to do. Confidence, not so easy to do. That's why we have test suites. That's why we have CI. That's why we have a lot of other tools in our space, is so that we can gain confidence, so that fast and automation work happens, with a degree that it's probably going to succeed. It's very easy to move fast with no guardrails, very easy. But it's the confidence piece that's really important. And so I started to think about, how do I measure if I'm able to move fast, and how do I measure my confidence, or some combination of those? So the other thing was, I didn't really want metrics that were reported by ICs, like from a sentiment point of view. Again, I'm not trying to dismiss surveys. I'm saying that once I've passed kind of what the survey is telling me in large groups, I wanted to get into something different. If you're, from a metric standpoint, not measuring the classic DevOps metrics, and don't have like things below that, like sprint metrics and team health reports and stuff like that, this conversation is beyond that. And so I kind of want to say, like, if you already have DORA metrics, this is going to be a really important conversation. If you don't, we'll start with those. They're pretty worthwhile. I'm not trying at all to dog on them and say they're bad. I'm saying once you're in this elite tier, there's some other things you can do. And so I wanted to move from IC reported metrics to aggregates. I wanted to look at things that I could derive. I wanted to look at things that were just at a departmental level, or at a directorship level, or whatever. Groups of teams instead of a single team, not an individual, things like that. Like, how do I look at this and see the overall performance of engineering? And again, move from reported, as in somebody turns in a survey and has some sentiment to tell you about, versus derived, versus I can detect this from engineering systems in some way, or I can detect this from I guess, other parties, not just from engineering. That's really important. And so it was like, all right, let's do some mad science on this and figure out what we come up with. And then it was kind of, well, what are the categories of things if I want to move fast with confidence and they're aggregates and they're not self-reported, they're not survey-based? What are the categories of things that I would care about? And so one of the things that came through was, well, is the engineering throughput good? Like, am I satisfied with the overall horsepower or output of the engineering department? Okay, that's a cool thing to know. Is the throughput that we're doing meaningful? You know, if I'm going 100 miles an hour the wrong direction, that's not very helpful. So is it a meaningful throughput? If I add more engineers, will we go faster? This is a classic question that often gets asked by people outside of engineering. These are conversations you may have with a CFO, or you may have with an executive team, or a CTO, or somebody else. And then also, can you prove that? Can you prove that the answer is yes or no? And I think that's a really interesting question as an engineering leader. A lot of times you think, well, if I had more engineers, I could move faster. And I've definitely seen the counter to that way more times. Well, maybe not more, but as many times as I've seen it be true. And so I kind of came up with this layer cake of metrics. And the only reason it's a layer cake is because it fit really nice on a slide and looked pretty. But we have quality metrics, we have people metrics, and we have some throughput metrics. And in some cases, they kind of bleed between the two. So it's not necessarily like you can only be in one box, but that's the way that I started to categorize things. And this is just my mental journey on this. And so if it doesn't map the way you would think about this, that's totally okay. But we'll start with throughput measurements, even though that was third on the other slide. Oh, well. And I started with just kind of deployments per week. How many deployments are we doing a week? And this is in that, okay, I can ship pretty often. Deployment frequency was a thing in the DORA metrics, but I was just trying to look at, okay, we have deployments per week. Okay. It wasn't that interesting. It didn't tell me a lot. And so I kind of moved on. And then I was like, well, does adding more developers make things go faster? If I add more developers, my deployment should go up. And I'm like, well, sure. But that's still like a linear scale. And so if I add 10 developers and say every engineer, is basically one deploy a week, I add 10, I get 10 more. That's not really that's not changing the curve. That's not improving my overall output. That's just linearly stacking and adding. And so it's, you spend a salary of a new developer and you get that other deployment. That's not really an optimization that I wanted to make. And so I started to look at, what if I look at deploys per developer per week? And this was something that it took me a while to get here, but once I realized this, I really liked this metric a lot. And part of it is, how many deployments, of course, mean that the work is finished, so it's real. It's going out, it's touching customers in some way, and you can do this whether you're a continuous delivery software as a service, type system, or if you have software that you're shipping to, an on-premises delivery or a client or a mobile app or whatever. Your deploy could be, okay, it's when it hits the main integration or whatever. It doesn't have to necessarily be like we've delivered the software out to the customer. I prefer it that way, but there are cases where you still want to be committing often, integrating often, but not necessarily shipping to a customer every day, medical scenarios or things. They don't want new updates every day. And that's totally fine. I respect that. But deploys per developer per week. And one thing, so there's a lot of things I really like about this metric. One of them is, if you have a bunch of people out of the office, you can kind of see the overall number usually stay the same, because the developers that are in the office should have about the right number of deploys. If you hire a new group of engineers, we used to hire in cohorts sometimes, and if you would hire 15 new engineers, you would see the deploys per developer per week drop for a little while you were onboarding those 15 engineers. And then you'd see it go back to normal, or even maybe increase some, because now you had capabilities you didn't have before with that new group of engineers. So I like this one because it kind of levels out and normalizes. This also models really nicely if you have a usage-based business. And of course, the CI provider was a usage-based business. And so if you had things like, well, we're going to have fewer builds this week because there's a holiday, say it's, some type of Labor Day or Memorial Day or things like that, you would see that both in our deployment metrics internally and in the business side of things. And so anything that connects the way the business models itself with the way engineering works, I felt like was very valuable, especially to explain to the leadership team and to have that connection to kind of the engineering and the business side of things. So this is by far my favorite metric that I've come up with. And in the summary at the end, I will bring it up again. There's just a lot of really nice things here that happen. And so you can kind of see, here was some real world data back in 2022 of pull requests and, per engineers and how many deployments per engineer and all this thing is. You can see that, this kind of tracks and maps over time, and there are big dips, like around the first of the year. Well, why is that? Well, everybody takes off. there wasn't a lot going on. There wasn't that much happening. So there weren't a lot of deployments going on. There weren't a lot of deployments for engineers because a lot of the engineers were kind of spending some time on their own personal projects, doing some hacking. It was kind of a free-for-all time. And that's totally fair. We understood that. So we can kind of find the things going on in the business based on deployments per week. And so when you get to 3, 4, 5 deployments per engineer per week, that's really good. And now you can say, Mike, not all deployments are the same. And you're totally right. But in large enough numbers, this starts to kind of level itself out a little bit. You can start with a thing like, some deployments are super simple. Like, hey, we fixed the spelling error on the third page on the left from the documentation. Cool. Okay, that's out there. That's probably a pretty easy deployment. The others are, hey, this was a whole new feature that, is being feature flag rolled out and it's only available to 5% of customers right now. Well, that's a neat deployment too. And then you can get into, things like, well, there's a bunch of engineers that spend a whole bunch of time doing reviews or doing design documentation and they don't deploy as often. Well, hopefully they're doing things to make everybody else deploy more. And so if some engineers are deploying 10 or 12 times a week, but others are only doing 1 or 2, it could be those ones doing 1 or 2 are actually enabling those 10 or 12 by a different group of engineers. And so again, at a large enough scale, this hopefully comes out in the wash. And for, the engineering team that this was done with was about 250 engineers. And so, it was not a huge number, but it was enough that you were kind of going to take some of the noise out of the signal just from the size of it. And so then I started looking at, okay, well, what else is distracting us from happening? Or are these deployments really like the things that the business cares about, or is it just movement through the system? And we get into this thing called narrow versus wide work. And this definitely came from reading some material from GitLab. They publish a lot of their engineering metrics and some of the stuff they've done deep dives on. Some of it feels like they wrote a heading once and they never came back to it in their handbook, but they at least keep it all out there in the public so you can read and follow along. Narrow is basically the idea that this is work that customers see or is on the core product. Wide is this is work that is kind of the overall work. It could be things like I updated a Terraform config, or we updated a configuration for this service, or we scaled out this service and that was a new deployment. It's kind of the infrastructure or the back-end work or the hidden work. That's all very important, but it's a different type of work than I've enabled a new feature for my customer base. And so when you start looking at narrow versus wide, there are some optimizations you can make too. And you can say, well, wow, we have a lot of wide deployments. Why do we have to do a new deployment every time we want to configure the number of nodes in the service? Couldn't that just be a key in etcd or in console or something like that we could update and that could happen live and then I wouldn't need to have a new deployment? Yes, you could do things like that. And so it does kind of drive some of those conversations to make you a little more agile or a little more scalable. But then you can start to look at, well, what do you think the ratio of narrow versus wide work actually is? And I don't know what the industry benchmarks are on this. I've talked to a few places that have tried to measure this. This is not necessarily a super easy thing to measure. For us, measuring this meant going through basically every repository and labeling it. Is this narrow or is it wide? And putting some metadata in there. And then you can get even more fine-grained and say, well, actually, if it's updating the README in a production repository, that's still wide work. Or if it's updating documentation for the engineers, that's still wide work. Or if it's updating test suites, that's still wide work. And so if you really want to get down to, what directory are you updating, depending on narrow or wide, you could do that. As far as I know, there's no off-the-shelf tooling that does this today. So you're probably going to spend time authoring this yourself if you care about it to that degree. We kind of stopped at this repository is mostly narrow, this one's mostly wide, and took it in broad strokes. But you could do more than that. We talked about doing more than that. We just didn't know if it was worth the investment. But back to, what does the industry look like for this? I don't know. I can tell you that at Circle, it was about 1 in 3 deployments was narrow. And so we were doing way more configuration updates and scaling and, Terraform and stuff like that, kind of infrastructure stuff on the back end. Those deployments were happening more often than things that were feature driven, which I don't think is that surprising, but I was not expecting like a 3-to-1 ratio. That was a little higher than I probably would have thought it was. And as we started looking at it and tracking it over time, it didn't change that much. And so we started trying to talk about what would we do differently? What would we do to make that narrow rate go up? Because narrow is kind of what the business cares about a whole lot. When the product team or the CFO or the CEO is asking, how's engineering doing? They don't really care how often you're updating Terraform. They don't really care how often you're scaling your infrastructure, unless that's the thing that's broken. No one cares about infrastructure unless it's not working. And I say this as an infrastructure person. It makes me sad that that's the case. It's just the truth of it. So we wanted to make sure that we were kind of converging those lines a little bit. And, did we do that? We worked on it. And I'm not saying we had a lot of success with it, but I do like this to know kind of how much of the work is going on around the system and how much is actually in the system. Then you can get to some people-based metrics. From a people perspective, the things you really care about are basically, are the humans happy? Do they enjoy the work? Are they good at the work? Are they able to work on different teams? And so you start asking these things like, are our systems easy to work on? If you've been a developer and you've worked in some systems, you feel like you can move with immense freedom and move very quickly. Why does a team of 5 move faster than a team of 25? In some cases, it's because there's just not a lot of constraints, and so they can just go. In some cases, there's not a lot of rules, there's not a lot of process. In other cases, it could be that team of 25 can move way faster because they can separate the work out very nicely, and they can, these 5 people work in this area, these other 5 work in another area, and therefore they can parallel track that very nicely. A lot of times we think we can parallelize things that doesn't work out very well because knowledge is trapped by one person, or the architect is only one person and he needs to sign off or she needs to sign off on multiple parts of that system before it can move. So are the systems easy to work on? One of the things that always frustrates me is every system has dashboards and things like that, but you have to be able to read them and understand them. And when you have different dashboards on different services and different systems, it's a lot more difficult to say, can I jump into this? Can I help here? Can I work on this? Do I get what's going on? And so maybe they're not easy to work on. Maybe there's a lot of complex scenarios. Maybe there's a lot of stuff happening. I like to make sure that services have as many common things in it as they can. And so we'll talk about that in a moment. But right now, the thing to think about is if the system isn't easy to move, if I can't move easily and I can't work on them, can I do some work to improve that? That would be something that we should invest in. And then you get into this thing that I usually feel like comes from product management more than engineering, but it gets asked a lot. And that's, well, why can't you take 3 developers from team 1 and put them on team 2 because team 2 is doing more important work, and we would like to have 3 more people over on team 2. Well, do we have fungible engineering? And obviously, people are not totally fungible. In fact, they're mostly not fungible very much at all. But there are things you can do to make this transition a lot easier. There are a few things that I try and do, like just from a leadership, strategy and approach perspective. I try to say I'd rather keep the team together and shift what work they're doing than totally like move the team around and move the people around. But sometimes you do have to move people around, or you have to make it easier for people to be able to move around. And some of this is for career growth. It's not always just for the whims of a product manager or the business side or some engineering leader. Sometimes you need this for career growth. Somebody's like, hey, I've been on this team for a while. I'd like to try something different. But I always do make sure to have a conversation about the Mythical Man Month with the people that are asking this. Why can't we take 5 engineers from team 1, put them on team 2? Well, sometimes when you add more people, it actually slows you down because you have to onboard them, you have to train them, you have to give them information, you have to show them how everything works, you have to familiarize them with the processes that this team uses. And of course, the Mythical Man Month covers all of this. And the quick summary is adding more engineers doesn't usually make you faster. If you've read this book, it's been a while since I've read it, but I do remember many of the key points. And I've asked other people to read it before. Most people don't, but if you buy them a copy, they'll at least put it on their desk. So we started to look at normalization. And when I think about normalization, I think about, do things work the same way in different settings? And so I just categorize this in broad, give it a broad heading of normalization. And so I wanted to look at, actually, I'm going to go back to this a little bit. I wanted to look at kind of, are things done the same way? If there's a deployment dashboard, does it look the same on service 1 as it does on service 2? And it could be, well, the first 4 panels are the same. Okay, well, that's great. And then you can get into a little more specifics that are maybe micro adjustments for each service. But if all services, and say you have a couple hundred microservices, if they all have the same dashboard for the first 4 panels, that would mean that anybody that knew how to deploy a service or see if a service was healthy could really step in and make an educated decision about what's going on with any other service. That's amazing. Or it could be that the code base is based from the same version of a tool chain or the same version of the JVM or whatever. And so or the same Docker image to start with or things like that. So you can start with the same common tooling, which means that jumping from one service to another isn't this, this shock to the system where you're jumping in from, hey, and one side we use Scala and another side we jump in and we're using Python. It's like, well, that's maybe a little different. And then another one we're using C++. Well, it's like, well, now I have to know all these different tool chains. And how do we get them out into production? There's a lot of differences there. And so I try and say, well, let's remove those differences. And even in the classic DevOps research that we did, the number one thing you can do to kind of increase a lot of your DevOps metrics is actually reduce your variance. If you have less variance, you're going to move faster. And it's the same thing here with fungibility for humans. If you have less variance, people can move teams or move the work that they're doing a lot easier. And they're happier about it too, because it doesn't feel like such a shock to the system. Humans have a finite tolerance for change. And so if you can reduce the number of change they have to feel at once, generally they're happier about it. So one of the things that we started to look for in this overall measurement of normalization was what % of code is provided by the platform? And we had a platform organization. And that organization, of course, housed things like security and infrastructure and networking and data centers and all of that kind of stuff. But they also had teams that were really focused on developer tooling and developer productivity and reuse of libraries. And so the thing that I was really interested from this was, okay, I have 8 engineers working on nothing but libraries. And things like, let's have a Postgres library that we know works, that if you use our library, it fails over properly. It's been tested. It's been tested in our environment the way we run Postgres. It's compatible with our deployment scenarios. It's compatible with our infrastructure and all those things. Okay, well, if they're using our Postgres client, then I don't really need to worry about the failure modes because we understand them. And then we had, a queuing client, we have a messaging client, we have, a client for gRPC, all of those kinds of things that we had built in. And basically, if all of your services are using all of that code provided by the platform, hopefully they're really just assembling the business logic on top of that to make the service unique in some way. And so, if you can get to 70% of the code is basically stuff that's provided by other parts of your company, that makes it a lot easier to work on, because now the surface area to jump into a service is hopefully much smaller and much more contained and much more easily understood than having to figure out, oh, this is not just the logic chasing through from a business perspective, but it does this weird thing to handle failover cases when it can't talk to a database. That's a thing that hopefully is abstracted and provided by the platform team, and the platform team then provides that. It's been tested, it's been validated, and so the developer teams are just out there saying, yeah, I included the Postgres module and we're good from that. And so we had a lot of measurements on normalization, and so this is an example of some of the stuff that we were trying to use to measure normalization. And so this is a closure shop, and so it was what percentage of services are using closure parents? Well, the closure parents are kind of the base that you inherit everything from closure for your standard libraries. It's kind of like bundler, package.json, whatever. So, okay, they're all using a modern version of CLJ parent. Okay, are they using recent backplane releases? That was our internal libraries. For a while they were not adopting very much. Then we drove adoption, that went up. So they have tracing enabled. We do tracing the same way on all these services. We have additional tracing, and so there was a bunch of stuff that we started to measure and tried to even move. And so I held the team responsible for. I need these numbers to go northbound, so that we have a more normalized system that people can work on, and that means that I can move more freely as an engineer between one service to another. I understand one service, that means I understand part of another service automatically. And so then you get into, well, okay, how fast are these humans productive? And part of that fungibility is how quickly can they be productive moving from one area to another. But it's also, if you onboard new engineers, or you hire new engineers, you replace engineers, how quickly are they able to actually be productive? And we talked earlier about the deploys per developer per week, how we could actually see when we hired a cohort, deployment, overall throughput would go down for a little while and then go back up. And how long does that dip? That's really the question that I was trying to answer with this. And the thing that I landed on, and it worked pretty well, was when do you get to your 5th contribution? And the reason that I use 5th is because the first one often was like, hey, I put my SSH key in a Terraform, plan, and so now I can log into some systems. Cool, not that valuable. And then maybe it was, hey, I updated a test, or I updated some documentation, or I've just poked around. And so, but I think by the 4th or 5th PR, you're probably doing work that is somewhat meaningful, and so you're starting to be a contributor to the team, and not just, hey, you're still in the onboarding process. 5th might not be the right number for you. It worked pretty well for us when we kind of looked back at the overall commits. And so how fast do you get to this? And you can kind of graph it and say, okay, on this team, people get to the 5th PR by day 7. On this other team, it's week 7. Well, why is that? Well, there's a lot to learn, and the on-call burden and all this. And so you can start to figure out, okay, this team needs a little more help in onboarding, or maybe we should just hire people with more experience in this area because it's more complicated to start with. Maybe it's a complex subsystem versus kind of a straightforward delivery application. But I always would come back and say, okay, if I've done those things properly with fungibility and I've done those things properly with onboarding, I should see all of that pan out in my deploys per developer per week setup. And so I just want to make sure that's happening. And I would look at that number every week and kind of say, hey, that adjusted the way I thought it would, or it didn't, or whatever. And so that was kind of the, how do I know if the rest of these efforts are working? And then you get into quality metrics. And then you get to successful deployments per week. And success, of course, is, I would say, not necessarily universally understood. Success could be the bits got out there. Success could be the bits got out there and they ran perfectly. Success could be we deployed to 2% of traffic. We decided it was bad, and so we didn't deploy to the rest because we had a successful test that it wasn't the right thing to do. But whatever your definition of success is, you kind of need to know that and see how many of those you're getting per week. And then you kind of have to take rollbacks with that or roll forwards. Basically, it's that deployment wasn't correct, so I had to take a corrective action of some type. For us, corrective actions were not super common. We didn't need to do them that often when you at the deployment volume we were at. But when you're at large numbers, if you have to do 1% rework, that still could be 13, 15 a week at times. That's still a lot. So that's the thing to kind of measure and look at. And then understanding the changes happening all around you. And part of that was, do you have incidents caused because somebody else made a change? Do you not want to make a change because you're working on a subsystem and somebody else is kind of interacting with that subsystem at the same time? And I haven't found a great metric there, but I have done a lot of education to kind of understand your dependencies, your upstream and downstream channels. That's still a lot to do. And so again, this fungibility with people and quality, they're very related because humans are the ones driving all of this. So, here's an example where we had release frequency, deployments per developer per week, through different types. We had the number of releases, the rollback rate, and the success rate. And as you can see, we were doing almost 900 deployments at times and having, 9 to 15 rollbacks, which I wouldn't say is too bad. And some of those were rollbacks that literally hit like 0.5% of traffic. And we're like, nope, that's not working. The error rate went up too high, things like that. So let's back out that change, or let's go modify that change to, make it behave slightly differently or whatever. And so I was pretty happy with this most of the time, but it still didn't feel elite because I can tell you that some of those systems where we had to roll back, that was an incident. It was a problem. It was downtime or service interruption for our customers. And when you have a couple of those a week, if you have 2 incidents a week, your customers lose faith in you. Even if you're doing 1,000 deploys a week and you have 2 problems, customers expect 0 problems. And so how do we work on that? Elite is not having to think about how many incidents somebody's had in a week, not having to know what the status page URL is, things like that. And that unfortunately wasn't the case, even with a team performing like this. So that was kind of a quick walkthrough on these quality people and throughput. And now I'm going to turn it a little bit and talk about it in a slightly different way. So when I started, I was I don't feel this elite. I have these baseline DevOps metrics. I look at my cohorts. We're in this elite tier, but it doesn't feel like we're all that elite, even though I'm in that elite tier. So what do I need to do? Well, I need to move quickly with confidence after I asked a bunch of questions about what would elite feel like. Thematically, I was able to group these metrics into kind of throughput, people, and quality, and then start labeling them and start figuring out, okay, which way do these all fit together? I feel like 2 of these areas I still want to do more work on, a lot more work on. That's fungibility, because I still feel like overall, getting engineers to move from one area to another, or taking the work from one area and putting it on a different team, has very mixed success. And this has been at multiple companies that I've tried to do this. And I think a lot of engineering leaders still try to do this all the time. And it's not because they want to, it's because they get forced into it one way or another. Given my own choices, I'm never going to say, let's just take some engineers from team 1 and put them on team 2 and magic will happen, unless the engineers on team 1 are saying, can I please go work with team 2? Because generally, again, just moving people around has a downside, both from team morale and from overall sentiment on how they're doing and their growth, unless they ask for it. So I don't like to just make people feel like pawns in a game that I'm steering things on. That's generally not a good way to run a department. And so I would like more metrics and measurement on fungibility, or you can call it time to onboard, or kind of that just getting started with the new tech or a new team or a new service. That's kind of that group of fungibility. I think there needs to be a little bit more research there and a little more metric and measurement there. And then the changes understood side of things is, do you really understand what's going on around you? Or maybe you only understand your service, but you don't understand the impact of, okay, if this service is having a problem, how does that cascade out through the customers? How does that cascade out through the rest of the business? Who needs to know if there's a problem? Who are the stakeholders for that workflow that your service fits into, or that your subsystem fits into? And I haven't really come up with a lot of great mechanisms there. And so those are kind of the two areas that I think are pretty weak. The rest of this stuff has worked pretty well and took some investment to build out the tooling, took some investment to build out the processes, but then could get on a scorecard that you could look at basically every week and say, hey, this was where I expected, or it wasn't, or why was this so different? Let's dig in here. You can start to run it kind of like just a metric review every week and say, okay, the business of engineering is happening the way I expect, or it's not, and let's go do some error correction. Now, with these metrics, some of them kind of fit into multiple categories, like I had said earlier. And so you can have narrow versus wide in the quality, that could be in quality versus just not in throughput or whatever. But I realized this was just my classification in my mind. And so you can poke holes in it all you want. It's not necessarily meant to be authoritative. It was supposed to be, hey, here's how I thought about it. So as a quick summary, and we've kind of come to the end here, so we'll have plenty of time for questions or discussions, but think about what do you want your metrics to tell you? And then can you correlate the movement of these metrics with intentional action that you can take and improved outcomes? There's a bunch of metrics, there's a bunch of things you can measure and look back and say, wow, that's interesting, but you don't know why that happened that way, or I don't know how I would move that number or how I would fix that number. You can just be like, that's a trailing indicator and it's interesting. It doesn't mean you shouldn't track it. It might mean that you shouldn't take a lot of time to try and improve it or measure it. And a lot of those are very trailing. Uptime is usually a trailing indicator. It doesn't mean you shouldn't track it, but you should probably be working on things that you think are going to drive uptime higher, but that's only an outcome. So you start looking at, well, I need fewer failed deployments, or I need fewer rollbacks, or whatever it is. Do you have baseline metrics already? There may be a bunch of things you already know. Write them down, track them over time, look at trends. Oftentimes trends are more important than the absolute value of the metric. So look at your trends. And for baseline metrics in this case, I usually mean kind of the classic DevOps metrics, the 4 or 5 that are in the DORA reports. I think there's 5 now in the modern ones, but 4 were the ones that I grew up with. And then, but even below that, do you have like sprint metrics? Are you using estimates? Are you getting through things that you want? Are your teams predictable? Are they delivering at a good clip? And that's kind of a team level thing. But if you have a bunch of teams that you're not happy with individually, you're probably not going to have a department that you're totally happy with in terms of aggregates. So start at the team level, and that may mean working with your engineering managers or your scrum masters or whoever is doing that type of work and asking what they're measuring and how they know if it's working. So, and the next question is how do you join up your engineering metrics with product management? Because inevitably, if you tell a story about how great your engineering team is and they can, they're moving at this clip and they can do, thousands of deployments a week or whatever, somebody's going to ask, but isn't stuff that matters? And that's a valid question. It's a great question. And so join up with your product management to kind of see what you can interweave between the product management story, the product delivery story, and the engineering throughput. But if you have one takeaway, deployments per developer per week is the one metric I would really start to work with once you've got your baselines. I really think it tells you a big story about how a lot of your other efforts are going. It's an aggregate metric. It's a roll-up metric. So you have to do a lot of work to kind of move different things underneath it to move that one. But I really think that deploys per developer per week is the one I would start with. And this has been corroborated, I guess, from some other people at other companies. I was sitting at a CTO forum in the Bay Area a couple months ago, and we sat down at a table to talk about this kind of stuff. And this was the one metric that every one of the leaders there that had done like an engineering productivity study or engineering productivity, department all came back with was basically, it was, someone called it commits per dev per week, someone called it deploys, but when they said commits, it was a deploy. I actually asked about that. And so this is a thing that I think a lot of different tech companies are starting to land on and lead with. And so I really want to emphasize that one. That's the end of the formal presentation. I'm happy to answer questions and conversation. Again, my name is Michael Stahnke. I work at Flox, but this was kind of more in partnership with UpLevel as well. So I want to thank UpLevel, CTO Craft, and Flox for letting me speak to you.
Thanks so much, Michael. Thanks so much, Michael. Do we have any questions? Apparently don't have any in the Q&A. Yeah, Rob VK has just said, thank you, very informative talk. So
yeah, and I can make sure these slides are available. I'll put them up on my slide share. And I don't know if CTO Craft sends out an email or anything afterwards, but I can make sure that that Megan has the link and we can make sure that gets out.
Yeah, we will share it in the Slack channel, and then also when I share the video, I can make sure that the the deck is shared along with the video as well, so make sure everyone has all the information they need. So we have a question here from Stephen. Deploys dev weeks feels like a vanity metric. Engineers could split work to create more PRs to improve their metric without adding value.
Oh, thank you for asking that. I totally forgot to cover that. Almost every metric can be gamed in some way. This is one of my favorite metrics because if you game it, you're only doing what I've asked you to do for my entire career, which is break your work into smaller chunks that are shipped more often and easier to integrate. So if you game this metric, cool, you can do 25 deploys instead of 1. Awesome. It's a lot smaller to recover from if you have that deployment going well. So I honestly haven't cared about this, and my engineers were like, well, we could just deploy more often. And I was like, okay, cool. We could make our work smaller. Okay, fine. And some of them did, and some of them were like, wow, this really, okay, you don't care. I'm not going to game it. And so they kind of backed away from it. But even if they do game it, it's fine. We've all asked for smaller chunks of work to be integrated, I think, as leaders, just because it's safer. It has less risk. So big fan of it. Some metrics can be gamed in a lot of ways. This one, I like the way it gets gamed.
Question from Rob here. Do you measure business value delivered?
I try to figure out how to do that. And so some of that is the narrow versus wide work. Narrow is kind of more in that business value. So you can look at how many deploys are actually delivering value in some way. But then there's also kind of that conjunction with product management at the end. I kind of mentioned if you can overlay that in some way. And so, you could say, okay, here's how many new systems we had, or, eventually you get into metrics like service adoption or feature adoption or throughput or revenue generated from this area. And those are the things that I try to look at more from a business value perspective, but I usually have to, sit with my product management counterparts and kind of join those two up. Business value varies greatly depending on the business you're in and how it's measured. And so for this, I was trying to really talk about the generic set of engineering tasks. But that does not mean you should do these in isolation without any business value or business discussions. So generally, I try and team up with product management for that and look at that way. I don't have a universal answer on that. If you have any ideas, I'm happy to hear them. I am not 100% authoritative on this, so willing to learn.
We have a question here from Joe. Do you have a good resource for someone trying to figure out how to measure effectiveness of a small team? Not to judge the people, but to see where we can gain efficiencies with automation or tools?
Short answer, no. But this is actually the struggle I'm going through right now. As I said, I changed companies a few months ago. For an engineering team of 250, I have 10 engineers right now. I'm not doing a lot of this advanced aggregate metrics of how it rolls up to the business and all of that. I'm like, if we said this was going to be done in 2 weeks and it took 4, why is that? Those are the types of things that I'm trying to figure out right now. And it's back to that kind of team level sprint health kind of thing, of are our estimates good? Do we have estimates? Are we pulling in work in the sprint that wasn't supposed to be there? Are people kind of taking detours and doing their own bug scavenger hunts or things like that? And so a lot of this is just like getting back to basics. And so I guess I would say the recommendation I might have here is do you have healthy sprints and can you prove that? There are some tools that really help with kind of how your sprint's going. Some of the Jira reports are pretty useful if you use Jira. UpLevel actually has a really nice sprint health dashboard. If you're, a smaller team, it'll tell you, hey, this is the thing that you're good at. This is the, it can do some predictive analysis and say, we think your sprint's going to end up like this. Shows you a little bit of sentiment or who's working, in the evenings when they're not so, maybe you don't want them to be, or who's the single point of failure for certain types of technology and things like that. So I would say, while I don't have a universal tool to tell you where to gain efficiencies in automation, there are tools here in this space that do help quite a bit. And I'll go ahead and recommend UpLevel because I've worked with it before and I liked it a lot. So I guess I do have an answer. The answer is probably try UpLevel out. It's pretty great. So,
any other questions? Oh, yeah, another one's just popped in from Stephen.
I haven't specifically myself run a survey to see, the question was, have you run DevX surveys along with the metrics to see if they're feeling more elite? I haven't run those surveys myself. What I have done is have developer tooling teams that are in my department run their own surveys to say things like, hey, we just released these 5 new libraries and they've been adopted over the last quarter. Do you feel like they're working the way you expect them to? Do you feel like they're allowing you to move faster on the things that matter and you're no longer having to worry about Kubernetes failure modes or database backends or whatever? And they do some sentiment analysis that way, but they're doing it more for the stuff that they built. Overall, I do a lot of this kind of one-on-ones where I would meet with a lot of more senior engineers and I would say, hey, do you feel like it's easier to do work now than it was 6 months ago? And inevitably the answer was some people yes, some people no. It depends on what problem space you're in. What, are you in net new things? Are you in more of a maintenance area? Things like that. So should I run a survey every now and again? Probably, but I also feel like survey fatigue is a very real thing. And there were a lot of surveys going through for other things from, HR or product management or other things. I will say surveys are not my favorite way to gather data anymore. It's also how do you craft the question matters so much on what the answer is going to be. And if you haven't sat down and spent like at least 20 minutes per question, you probably don't know what you're going to get for an answer. And so I don't enjoy surveys very much. I'll say that. Doesn't mean sentiment's not a real thing that you can't gather in some other ways.
Any more questions? Just waiting for them to come in. If not, no worries, because I will be sharing some contact details of getting in touch with Michael. So if you think of any questions after the event, his LinkedIn is there. So please do reach out. I'm sure Michael will be happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you all for joining. It was really informative. As you can see in the chat, people are already saying how informative the session was. And thank you so much, Michael, for your talk. The next event in the diary is happening next Friday on the 28th of July, and it will be a virtual event. We're going to be joined by Rebecca Murphy, who is the Head of Engagement and Insights at Swarmia. Rebecca will be sharing how you can embed developer experience into your organization, and you'll be learning about spotting high-impact productivity opportunities that span teams, gathering quantitative and qualitative insights from your customers without being annoying, recognizing when it's time to fix the past versus shape the future, quantifying the impact of improvements or not, avoiding common failure modes when you're still small, and remembering that the customer is not always right. The event page is also posted in the chat, so I hope to see you then. Enjoy your weeks, and yeah, big thank you all.